The first thing anyone noticed about Walt Denning's North Field was the color. Not gold, not amber. Black, or close enough that from the county road, people slowed their trucks to look twice. Rows of wheat, heads bowed with grain, standing dark against the July sky like a shadow that had forgotten to move with the sun. Walt stood at the edge of it, hand resting on a fence post, the way he did most mornings, watching the wind pass through the heads and turn them a deep, dull bronze black, almost purple, in the right light. 61 years old, forearms weathered the color of the post itself, he'd farmed this ground his whole life and inherited the stubbornness that came with it. "You gonna cut that or bury it?" Walt didn't turn around. He knew the voice, Ron Kessler, who farmed the section next to his and had opinions about everything that grew. "Cutting Thursday," Walt said. "Cutting what, though? That's my question." Ron leaned against his truck, arms crossed, grinning in the easy way of a man who thought he was being kind by being blunt. "Looks like you let it burn and forgot to tell anybody. It's wheat, Ron. Sure looks like it had a bad night." Walt let that sit. He was used to it by now, 3 seasons of it. The grain elevator in town had taken one look at his first delivery and told him politely that they couldn't run it through their system without knowing what it would do to the rest of the batch. "We don't have a bin for whatever this is, Walt." The seed dealer he'd bought from for 30 years asked, half joking, if he'd been storing his seed next to a wood stove. It didn't look dead. Walt knew dead wheat. This wheat stood straight, filled its heads heavy, and shrugged off the dry spell that had cracked the topsoil on Ron's side of the fence, 2 Augusts running. But it was black, or near enough. And in a county where wheat had always been the color of an old dog's coat, that made it a joke before it made it anything else. "You could just get shed of it," Ron said. "Plant something people will actually buy." "I'll think about it," Walt said, which was what he always said, and which meant nothing was going to change. What Ron didn't know, what nobody knew because Walt had never told a soul, was that the seed for that field had come from a coffee can in his father's tool shed, and before that, from an envelope so old the ink had gone the color of rust. His father had kept it for reasons Walt was never quite told. "Keep this planted somewhere, even if it's just a row," his father had said once, the autumn before he died, not looking up from the tractor he was fixing. "Don't let it run out." Walt had been 34 at the time, and had nodded the way you nod at an old man's instructions you don't fully understand. He hadn't planted it every year. There'd been a stretch in his 40s when the coffee can sat forgotten on a shelf, and Walt sometimes wondered, with a small cold feeling, if that stretch had cost him something he couldn't get back. But 3 years ago, cleaning out the shed after his mother passed, he'd found the can again, the seed still inside, dry and dark as a row of burnt match heads. He'd planted a half-acre almost as an act of remembering his father more than any real plan. Now it was 4 acres, and it was costing him. The practical trouble started that same August when the elevator manager, a decent man named Kurt Halverson, called Walt into his office instead of just waving him through the scale. "I can't blend it," Kurt said. "Buyers are asking about color uniformity I can't answer. I'd have to store it separate, and I don't have a bin free for 4 acres of a wheat nobody's ever heard of. So what do I do with it? Sell it private, maybe, or don't grow it." Kurt said it kindly, but it landed the way bad news does even when delivered gently. Walt had a combine payment due in October, and 4 acres of black wheat wasn't going to cover it if nobody would take the grain. He drove home that evening, turning it over. Ron was right, in the way people can be right and still miss the point entirely. The wheat took up ground he needed. Carol had stopped asking about it out loud, which was its own kind of pressure. The pressure of someone not wanting to say, "I told you so," before there was anything to say it about. But Walt kept coming back to one thing that nobody else seemed to notice, because nobody else was standing in that field at 6 in the morning the way he was. The black wheat wasn't just standing through the dry spell. It was standing through it better. While Ron's wheat 200 yards away had started curling at the leaf edges by late July, Walt's black wheat held its color, held its weight. He'd walked the line where the two fields met more than once, run his thumb along a head from each side, and felt the difference. His side heavier, more grain-packed into less space. He didn't say anything about it. Not yet. He wasn't sure what he was seeing, and Walt Denning did not go around making claims he couldn't back up. There was another pressure, too, one he hadn't told Carol about. The well pump on the north side had gone out in July, eating most of what he'd set aside for spring seed. He mentioned the wheat's trouble to Kurt again in September, half hoping for a workaround. Kurt just shook his head. Nobody's set up to handle small lots of an unidentified variety. If you can find a specialty buyer willing to take it direct, that's your best shot. So Walt called 2 specialty flour mills 2 counties over and got the same polite version of no both times. Interesting. But we'd need to know exactly what we're milling before we could buy it. By October, he had 4 acres of grain sitting in a borrowed bin at his cousin's place, unsold, and a combine payment that wasn't going to pay itself. Carol found him at the kitchen table one night with the checkbook open and the yield numbers on the back of a feed receipt. She didn't say anything about the wheat, just looked at the numbers, then at him. You could plant that ground in something the elevator will actually buy next year. I know, Walt said, and neither of them pretended that was a decision made with the numbers in front of him. It was his granddaughter, Emma, home from her first year of ag school, who put a name to what he'd only been noticing. She'd come out to the field in early August with a soil probe and a notebook, half for a summer project, and half because Carol had asked her to look in on him. She spent an hour walking both fields, taking moisture readings, and came back to the porch with her eyebrows up. "Grandpa, your side's holding almost double the soil moisture at 6 inches. Same rain, same soil type, same slope." "I noticed it holds up better," Walt admitted. "Didn't know the why of it. It might be the root structure. Some older varieties root deeper, bred that way before anybody worried about combine height." She flipped back through her notes. "Where'd you get this seed? I've never seen a wheat this dark. It's not just a red Durham thing. It's really dark." Walt was quiet a moment. "Your great-grandfather kept it. Told me not to let it run out." "Did he say where he got it?" "No," Walt said, and realized, saying it out loud, that this was the first time in 27 years he'd wished he'd asked. "Is there anything left of his records, anything? Old seed tags, receipts?" Walt thought about the shed, the shelf where the coffee can had sat untouched for years. "There's a box of his old papers in the attic. Your grandmother never could throw it out." They went through it together that evening, Carol pulling the box down while Emma spread yellowed papers across the kitchen table. Old receipts, a mail route card, a faded photo of a threshing crew none of them could name. Near the bottom was an envelope with no return address, the paper gone soft at the creases. Inside, nothing but a name in pencil, half smudged, Isseus Tally. No explanation, no date beyond a partial postmark that might have read 1938. "Who's Tally?" Emma asked. Walt turned the envelope over twice, like it might tell him something the front hadn't. "Never heard the name in my life." Emma didn't let it go in the patient, needling way of someone 20 years old and newly educated. She photographed the envelope, took a few heads of the wheat back to school with her in the fall, and dropped both, mostly in passing, on the desk of a professor who taught a seed genetics elective. The kind of thing a granddaughter did to be polite to an old man's hobby, more than anything she expected to matter. The professor, though, didn't let it sit. He ran a quick pigment and morphology comparison against the reference collection he kept for teaching, found nothing close to a match, and, more out of habit than expectation, sent a portion of the sample with a short note. To a colleague at the state's grain germplasm program, the kind of favor researchers do for each other a few times a year. Most such samples came back unremarkable. This one didn't. A preliminary genetic screen flagged markers that didn't line up with any modern commercial variety, and a researcher named Priya Anand, who spent her days chasing down exactly this kind of anomaly, pulled the file and made a note to find out where the sample had come from. The call came on a Tuesday in November, months after harvest, while Walt was in the machine shed replacing a hydraulic line. "Mr. Denning, my name's Priya Anand. I'm a research associate with the Regional Seed Preservation Program out of the State University, partnered with the National Grain Germplasm Collection." He paused, unhurried, professional. "Your granddaughter shared a wheat sample with one of our collaborators a couple months back. We ran it through some genetic screening. I'd like to ask you a few questions about where the seed came from, if you have a few minutes." Walt set the wrench down on the tractor fender. "What kind of questions?" "Mostly about the seed's history, family origin, how long it's been grown, any records, letters, notes, anything like that." Another pause. "The genetic profile is unusual, Mr. Denning. It doesn't match anything currently in our regional collection, and it's showing markers consistent with wheat lines widely grown in the early part of the last century and then mostly lost, replaced over time by higher yield modern varieties as breeding programs moved on, and the old seed stock simply wasn't maintained. If what we're seeing holds up, this could be one of only a handful of surviving samples of a heritage line we thought was gone." Walt didn't say anything for a moment. Out past the open shed door, the November wind moved across the stubble of the field where the black wheat had stood. "There's something else," Priya went on. "Our collaborator mentioned your granddaughter's moisture readings. That your wheat held up noticeably better than the wheat next to it during dry weather this summer. That's consistent with something in the preliminary data. A few of the markers we're looking at are associated, in a handful of older lines, with deeper rooting and more efficient water use under stress. It's early. We'd need a full growing season of controlled comparison before we could say anything definite. But if it holds, that's exactly the kind of trait breeding programs are looking to bring back into commercial wheat. So, what I was seeing in the field. Maybe the reason we're calling you at all," Priya said. "You noticed it before we had any idea it was there to notice." Walt found himself gripping the wrench again without meaning to. "My granddaughter mentioned an old envelope. Name on it. Tally. That mean anything to you?" There was a pause on the line, longer than the others. "It might. There was a regional seed exchange network active in this area in the 30s. Farmers trading unusual varieties by mail during the worst of the Depression, when commercial seed was hard to come by. A few names come up in old agricultural bulletins from that program. Tally sounds familiar. I'd have to check. Most of what survived from those networks was passed hand to hand, not through any official channel. So I don't want to promise you an answer before I've confirmed it. But it would fit." She paused. "What your family did, keeping a small planting going even inconsistently for decades, is exactly the kind of thing that keeps a line like this from disappearing. We'd like to come see the field if you're willing. and talk about documenting and preserving it properly. They came out the following week, Priya and an older researcher named Dr. Felt, who'd spent 30 years cataloging regional grain varieties and walked the stubble fields slower than anyone Walt had ever watched cross a piece of ground, stopping every few feet to pick up a stray head the combine had missed. "Your father ever say anything about where this came from?" Dr. Felt asked, crouched at the fence line where Walt's field met Ron's empty one. "No, just that I shouldn't let it run out." Felt nodded slowly. "That's not nothing. A lot of these lines survive because somebody's father said exactly that, and nothing more. And the son did it anyway without knowing why." He straightened up, knees cracking. "We may never know exactly how your family came by it. A seed swap, a county fair exchange back in the 30s. Doesn't change what it is now. It's here, and it's alive, because you kept planting a coffee can's worth of seed even when it made you look foolish to every other farmer on this road." Walt thought about Ron leaning on his truck. He thought about Kurt at the elevator, kind but unable to help. He thought mostly about his father at the tractor, not looking up. What happens to it now? We'd like to grow it out properly, increase the stock at the university's plots, get it formally accessioned so it's protected long-term. And we'll run your granddaughter's water use observations through a proper trial, side by side with modern lines, over a few seasons. If it holds up, that's the kind of trait breeders would want to work with." Felt smiled, the first real smile Walt had seen from him. "It started with you noticing something in a field everybody else had already decided wasn't worth a second look. If you're willing, we'd like to name the line in the records after your family. Denning wheat. Seems right." Ron heard about it before Walt said a word to him. Small towns work that way. He drove over on a Saturday afternoon, parked at the end of the drive, and stood at the fence a long moment before he spoke. "Heard the university's coming out for your wheat." "They are." Ron nodded, looking out at the empty stubble. "I called it burnt. Told everybody you planted charcoal." Not quite an apology, more an accounting. "Guess I was wrong about what it was." "You weren't wrong about what it looked like," Walt said. "Just what it was." Ron huffed something close to a laugh and let it go at that. Neither man needed more from the other. That was the kind of country they were. The following spring, Walt planted the black wheat again. 6 acres now, with a row set aside exactly the way his father had once kept a row aside, without explanation. Emma came home most weekends to help with the university's monitoring, the same kind of notebook she'd carried the summer before, except now there were 3 other researchers' names on the sign-in sheet tacked to the shed wall. In late June, Walt walked the field alone in the early light, the wind moving through heads that were no longer just his family's quiet secret, but something written down now, protected, accounted for. He pulled a head free, rolled it between his palms until the black hulls fell away, and let a small handful of dark grain rest in his palm. It looked the same as it always had, small, dark, unremarkable to anyone who hadn't been told otherwise. He thought about his father at the tractor, not looking up, saying it like it was nothing. "Don't let it run out." 4 words Walt had carried for 27 years, without knowing what they were actually asking of him. He'd taken them at the time for an old man's quiet stubbornness about a coffee can of seed. It had taken a granddaughter with a soil probe, a stranger's name on a forgotten envelope, and a phone call from 400 miles away to show him they'd been an instruction, not a preference. Walt closed his hand around the grain and let the wind finish the rest. He'd thought all those years he was just keeping his father's word. Turned out he'd been keeping something the whole county would eventually need.